Up, we have, I humbly state, the most eye-rolling argument of them all. Thanks again, Craig. The moral argument goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Objections. Well, we could take the anti-realist position and simply state, no, objective moral values and duties do not exist, and in doing so, reject premise 2. Get over it, Bucko. Or, if you believe that morality is objective, you can do this. In Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro, Socrates asks Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Or in other words, is something morally good loved by God because it's morally good, or is it morally good simply because God says so? Well, if it's morally good just because God says so, then morality is not morality at all. It's might makes right. That's it. It's about whether or not you can live up to the arbitrary whims of this celestial dictator. That's not morality. Not at all. However, on the other hand, if they say that it's morally good in and of itself, then morality obviously supersedes God, and thus we can reject the first premise. Now, I have 6,235 slides.
Okay, well, Steve will not get through his slides, and we will not finish the rest of it. But Jono, what do you think here with regards to the moral argument?
There's a lot I could say here. So I do think the Euthyphro dilemma is a good... I'll step back. So someone who's influenced my thinking on ethics is Ben Watkins, and I more or less agree with him on most things, at least in meta-ethics, not so much applied ethics, but that's a separate topic. So I would defend the moral non-naturalist position, like philosophers like Derek Parfit or Shelley Kagan. I think with the Euthyphro dilemma, it's a good objection, but I'd want to phrase it differently because it's from Plato. So it's in the context of polytheism, and it's talking about things being loved by the gods. So I think in its original formulation, probably not as relevant to kind of contemporary monotheistic divine command theory. So I think a more interesting way to use the Euthyphro dilemma to object to the moral argument is to put it in terms of like the principle of sufficient reason. So how would I say this? Does God have a reason to command don't do this? Or like, is his command the reason to not do that? Like, does God not have reasons for his commands? And then you have the two horns there. So if he does have reasons, then those reasons explain the moral obligations, not God. But if he doesn't have reasons, then it's like the arbitrary objection. I've never really heard you defend a kind of Craigian moral argument. Maybe I just haven't been paying attention. Is that
No,
an argument
I haven't.
you like? You haven't?
So I'm kind of agnostic. I'm very much a moral realist, and like I agree, and like I think of God is perfect. But then like, can you run like Craig's moral argument? And I don't know, because like I have some sympathy with like a Euthyphro dilemma. I always butcher the pronunciation, but then I also just wonder, like, given like atheism, like how do you ground moral realism? And like I know there's theories, but I'm like, what's the best? And I'm just kind of, I don't know. I'm kind of stuck on that. So that's why I don't defend it, because I don't think I can defend it well, but I don't think it's like a bad argument. So
yeah. So not to push back on what you're saying, if you'd said that you were super confident and had well thought out views, I would like push back. But the thing you said about what grounds it on atheism, there's kind of an implication that the theist does have a good grounding for it. And if I was talking to someone who's defending a moral argument, I'd want to push them on that. Yeah. And then I'd talk about the Euthyphro problem, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think Josh Rasmussen has an interesting idea that I'll read on, like, is God the best explanation of things? And like, if you read in that, like, the dialogue about the moral argument, like Felipe Leon, and like in some sense, Josh, like, he agrees with like the Euthyphro dilemma. Yeah, there you go. I just have it online in the PDF. But he talks about, like, he says, and here's a quote. He says, "To be clear, then, I say that the perfect nature contains or makes not makes the principles of value. To be precise, all value and all principles of value flow from a single simple feature, perfection. Hence, perfection itself is valuable in a basic way. Perfection is not valuable because it's part of God's nature. Rather, perfection is part of the foundation's nature because the foundation is supreme." So something like that is probably the most plausible idea to my mind, where we see God is not someone that like makes moral values, but he just like is perfect in a sense. So I don't know. It's still tricky, but that's where I'd lean right now.
So would Rasmussen say that in the context of defending a moral argument, or is that like a response to the Euthyphro problem?
Yeah. So in the previous chapter, and I haven't read this book since the summer, but I do remember this. Like in the previous chapter, Leon kind of presents like a Craigian version of the moral argument and like talks about like a modified, I think it's a modified version of the Euthyphro dilemma, Euthyphro dilemma. I don't know how to say it, whatever. And like Josh is kind of responding to that, and he doesn't make like a moral argument, I think. And this is like a big part of his book where he talks about just like these different things, like say like consciousness or reason or moral knowledge. Like let's just put them all in the foundation. The foundation just is these things, and something like that is what I understand it to be.
Yeah, I also think that if I was a theist, I'd go with Swinburne's option. So if you take the camera is like shifted, so I was trying to show my hand, but if you take Socrates' theory of moral motivation, if you take moral facts, and if you take God's perfect knowledge and you mesh them together, you get kind of Swinburne's account. So he'll say that in God's omniscience, she knows every moral fact, and because knowledge of moral truths motivates you, therefore God is morally perfect, something along those lines. So I think that's quite a plausible way to talk about the moral argument not working, but you still have like a perfectly good God if you just go the route via moral motivation.
Yeah. I think like where I lean towards now is just saying something like God just is perfect, and perfect goodness and something like that. But I mean, I haven't thought this out like super well, and that's a reason why I haven't like actually defended the moral argument. I think like I've defended like moral knowledge arguments because I think those can be a lot more powerful and easier to defend. But it does get tricky with the moral argument, and like I realize that. So yeah.
I think moral knowledge arguments are pretty interesting. Like, are you thinking Planiger, that kind of thing? Like, how do we have reliable moral perceptions? Or...
So the first time I thought about it was in the Blackwell Companion. I'm trying to think who wrote that. Maybe Mark Linville? No, or maybe he might have wrote a different chapter. But whoever wrote the moral argument chapter, I was going into it thinking like it's going to be like Craig's moral argument, but then it was like a moral knowledge argument. And I was thinking about like, so given the process of like evolutionary, like naturalism, like how on earth do we have this accurate moral knowledge where we can like say these things? And it seems to me just very unlikely. And that's when I became more of a fan of the moral knowledge argument.
Yeah, maybe I'll just make a brief comment on Craig's answer to the Euthyphro problem. So he defends the kind of basic two-premise conclusion moral argument. And his solution to the Euthyphro problem is that it's a false dilemma because God is the good, right? So it's not either one of those two horns. And I think that kind of just leaves you open to another Euthyphro problem. So, like, God is the good. Is there reasons for why God is that way? Or I'd have to maybe write it down to formulate it. But you could just ask a new Euthyphro problem about why God as the good has these moral properties as opposed to those other ones.
Yeah. That's
so you could say like, what's a necessary moral truth mean you both agree on? Like, it's wrong to eat babies or something. You could say, is it wrong to eat babies because it's against God's nature? Or is God's nature such that it is against eating babies because necessarily eating babies is wrong? It kind of just another Euthyphro problem. Yeah. Did I explain that properly? Or
yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. So yeah.
Cool.
Do you have anything else you want to share, Jono, with regards to like the moral argument, or we can lean towards like wrapping this up because we have all the clips we wanted to play knocked out. So
not really. I think that's all on the moral argument.
Yeah, it's super helpful. Yeah, I think we're good. We covered everything, and obviously, like Steve doesn't like use this. Like he's doing this. Like this was a fun talk he did at some atheist conference, so he wasn't like trying to like actually like seriously like debunk all of theism. But he did write like theism debunk. Like what was the title of the video? Every argument for God debunked. So I was like, oh, well, we should do this. This will be fun. So we responded to that and saved theism maybe. So
So maybe I will add one thing on the moral argument. I think if you want to learn about my thoughts, you can listen to Emerson Green's podcast. He has an episode with Ben Watkins. It's like episode 26 or something called like God and Moral Realism on the Counter Apologetics podcast. I think that was a very helpful episode, so I'd recommend that.